Hey guys, this is just a quick overview of the physiology of the plasma membrane. So the plasma or cell membrane is again just a pliable structure that's composed of a phospholipid bilayer. And it also generally has cholesterol and various other proteins that are embedded within it or even on top of the membrane. And all of this is going to contribute to the fluidity of the membrane and physiological aspects of it, such as what can move through it. Okay. So a phospholipid is just a molecule that has a phosphate group at one end and two side-by-side chains of fatty acids. The polar phosphate head is hydrophilic or water-loving, and that's going to interact with the inside of the cell as well as the outside of the cell. And the fatty acid tail is hydrophobic or water hating. And so those tails are on the inside of the membrane interacting with each other. So phospholipids are what we call unsaturated because there is the existence of double bonds that are creating kinks in the tails. And what these kinks do is they increase membrane fluidity by pushing adjacent phospholipids away from one another. Now this bilayer is situated again so that the hydrophobic tails are associating with one another. And remember that they are uncharged and they're nonpolar, right? So that's going to expel water and only lipid-soluble molecules can diffuse through, right? And again, the polar heads are going to make contact with the cytoplasm on the inside of the cell as well as the water on the outside of the cell. And again, they're polar, so they're water loving, and they also have a negative charge. Okay. Now, let's look at cholesterol and some of the proteins that you can find here. You have integral proteins that are embedded within the membrane. These generally act as channel proteins that allow for facilitated diffusion of polar molecules. And again, facilitated diffusion is just the use of a channel protein, but there's no use of ATP. Right? It's just purely the use of a channel protein. These integral proteins can act as enzymes that also aid in cell adhesion, right? Adhesion between cells. And there's also glycoproteins that have carbohydrate attachments that you can see in this picture, and those are used for recognition. Okay, they're receptors. Now you also have peripheral proteins that are found on the inner and outer surface of a membrane. They can also be found attached to integral proteins. So there's also the existence of these peripheral proteins. And there's also the existence of cholesterol that again helps balance the permeability and fluidity of the membrane. So the permeability, that's just the cell membrane being what we call semi-permeable. So it regulates the passage of certain molecules. Now, lipid-soluble or nonpolar molecules can generally just pass right through. And of course, this is going to depend on size, right? If it's a large molecule, it's going to need some facilitated diffusion. If it's a small molecule, though, it can pass through relatively easily. So lipids, oxygen, carbon dioxide, gases, and alcohol, they can actually pass through. Water-soluble substances need the help of those channel proteins to diffuse across the membrane. So glucose, amino acids, electrolytes, they're going to need the help of those channel proteins to pass through the membrane. So we have what's called passive transport and active transport. So diffusion is, again, just the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So it's particles that are moving along a concentration gradient. Diffusion in general is considered passive transport because it's not expending any energy to move across the membrane. But you also have facilitated diffusion, which is just diffusion with the help of transmembrane proteins. So if it's a large molecule, it's not going to be able to pass easily through the membrane, even if it's lipid soluble. So it's going to need the help of those channel proteins. And so that's called facilitated diffusion. There's still no expenditure of energy in facilitated diffusion. So that's why it's called passive transport. In active transport, however, that is when energy is expended in the form of what we call ATP, or adenine triphosphate. So both facilitated diffusion and active transport require the use of channel proteins. And these channel proteins can be what we call gated, meaning that they're engaging in channel-mediated transport. And these gated channels can be open or closed. You have two types. You have ligand-gated channels, which require a specific molecule to bind to the receptor in order for the channel to open. But you also have voltage-gated channels, which is when the channel opens or closes in response to changes in membrane potential. And the best example of that is the sodium-potassium pump. And the sodium-potassium pump, you can find it in your neurons, for instance, when there's a action potential going down your neuron, specifically the axon of the neuron. They're going to open and close in response to the changes in membrane potential once it's been depolarized. And this, of course, requires the expenditure of ATP. So that means that the sodium-potassium pump is involved in active transport. Okay, so that is all for this video. You want to watch the osmosis and diffusion video next. This was just a quick rundown of the physiology of the plasma membrane.